Dr. Raymond Moody, the medical doctor who named and defined the near death experience. Together, we have written 5 books on near death experiences, but our 6th book, Proof of Life After Life 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife, goes beyond the near death experience and into a new field of study, the study of shared death experiences. And that's where we are with this course, a deep dive into shared death experiences, also known as objective death experiences. And that's where we are with this course, a deep dive into shared death experiences. These are also known as objective death experiences. These mystical experiences prove without a doubt that consciousness survives bodily death. Before we move forward with our master classes on the afterlife, I think it would be helpful if Dr. Moody framed these exciting classes with a thorough explanation of just what is a shared death experience.
Yes. I think probably, unless you've been hanging out in a cave in the Himalayas for the last 50 years, that probably everybody listening to this knows about near-death experiences, which are an astonishing form of consciousness that occurs to people who come close to death. They almost die, and yet they survive. Very often, for example, in the context of a cardiac arrest from which they are revived. And in those circumstances, it's well known, people say that they leave their physical bodies and they go through a passageway into another world, and they see a light in which they see all their relatives and friends who have passed away, who are there with them in spirit form. They may talk of everything else kind of disappearing, and they're surrounded by a holographic panorama consisting of everything they've ever done, although viewed in reverse, because you see each action not from your perspective when you did it, but rather the perspective of the person with whom you've interacted. And people are profoundly affected by this review of their lives, and they come back profoundly transformed. Now, one of the standard ways we have of processing this kind of information in the West came to us from the Greeks, because Plato and Democritus, who about the same time as Plato had a different view of these things. He had figured out that we're made of atoms, right? And he said these experiences of people who appear dead and then they're revived, he said that's simply the invisible biological activity is going on, because he said there's no such thing as a moment of death. Meanwhile, Plato took these same kind of stories as indicators of an afterlife. Now, that's the way we think of it in the West and have for 2,300 plus years. What the significance of shared death experiences is this. Shared death experiences consist of those same elements that I mentioned: leaving one's body, going part way toward a light, seeing deceased relatives and friends, sometimes even seeing a life review, but these experiences occur not to somebody who almost dies and is revived, but rather bystanders at the death of someone else who are not themselves ill or injured. And yet they have all of these things that we associate with the near-death experience. People at the bedside may, for example, that said, as grandma died, I myself left my body and I went up part way toward this light with her, and then I came back and rejoined my body. People will, at the bedside, will say they see the apparitions of the dying person's deceased loved ones coming into the room as though to escort the dying person away. Or people may say that the hospital room fills with this light that is just so completely indescribable. And I mean, as incredible as this is, I have quite a number of cases accumulated over the years of bystanders at the death of someone else who, as the person was dying, the bystander themselves empathically co-lived the dying person's life review. This is the most unsettling information in a way to me that I know in this, because personally I'm hoping to get myself recused from my own life review, much less the idea of a spectator there. But in the reality of these cases, it's not as severe as you might imagine. I remember years ago in Carrollton, Georgia, talking with this elderly woman who a while before had lost her husband. And she and her husband had a kind of relationship that used to be very common in the South. People who raised, two doors down as they were, just grew up as childhood playmates and then naturally evolved into a marriage. And so she knew his life very well. And she was describing to me how when he was dying in the hospital, she was there with him. And she said that his whole life kind of sprang up around them, and they were able to discuss some aspects of this with each other. Now, for a long time, I assumed that this had to be somebody who was very close to the person who was dying. But that turns out not to be the case either. It's some years ago, my wife and I got a communication from an emergency room doctor who had been called to the ER to resuscitate a patient. He had never laid eyes on this patient. But as the patient was passing away, the doctor said that he saw this man's life in review, and just sort of sprang up around him. And these kind of experiences are very hard to put into a framework, and we just don't have any framework to how to figure out what this means. And that's why I think they are so significant, and also why I think that it is a harder thing for people to come to terms with than near-death experiences. In a near-death experience, the idea is a kind of distance, like right, that this other guy, he almost died, and we can distance ourselves from it. But in the case of the bystanders at the bedside of somebody who does die, that they have these experiences too, that opens up the possibility that, oh my goodness, that might happen to me. And that's harder for people to think about. And the first one I ever heard from this was my first year in medical school, from one wonderful professor who approached me. And I had already been known for my work on near-death experiences by when I got to medical school. And so my professor told me about her own, what I now call shared death experience, as she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother, that she herself left her body and saw the thing from above, and saw her mother there in spirit form, was her word, and then saw her mother recede away into this tunnel, and saw their relatives and friends, some of whom she recognized, of her mother's who had predeceased her mother, who then she saw in this light. And then she came back to her body, and this kind of thing happens. And I've noticed over the last few years that it's getting increasingly okay for physicians to talk about their experiences like these. I think there was an earlier generation of medicine. My dad was a medical student, and I was there at his medical school graduation, right? So, I mean, I saw this whole, and they had met, most of them had been in World War II. And so it was just a generation of toughness. And although occasionally when I would go around to institutes to lecture, medical doctors would tell me of these things, but it was much less common. Whereas now, doctors are okay with saying, yeah, when the patient died, I saw this mist leave the body, or these other kinds of things that happen. And one of the fairly common kind of things that happens in in that situation, is when the bystander sees something leave the body at death, very often described as a mist or a presence or like whatever.
So, as you know, I think I mentioned this already, Raymond named and defined the near death experience. He's been around this field now for over 50 years and has collected hundreds of stories. I think he remembers every single one of them.
I
And
don't think so, Paul. I don't think
he remembers a bunch of them.
a lot of them. A lot of them.
And he'll tell a lot of these great stories during these classes. So, once again, we're dealing with shared death experiences, which are considered to be objective because there is at least one other person who witnesses or even co lives these paranormal events. And when a healthy person experiences what a dying person is experiencing, we are no longer dealing with one person's perception, also known as subjective evidence. We're dealing with objective evidence. And in these cases, we're dealing with events that have more than one witness. This is solid evidence that is not based on one person's interpretation. It's the kind of evidence, actually, that stands up in court. Now, don't get us wrong. We believe that the millions of people who have and described their near-death experiences are not making them up. But there are skeptics. There are those who say that near-death experiences are hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen to the brain, are fear, are too much anesthetic, are not enough. So exploring shared death experiences is the answer to the skeptics, because the answers prove that consciousness can exist independent of the human body. Now, the title of this masterclass series is Proof of Life After Life: 7 Reasons to Believe There is an Afterlife. And even though I do say so ourselves, the use of the word proof in almost any context is very risky. Are we declaring too much by using proof as part of the course description, Raymond?
Well, I was a professor of logic, and I have very precise notions about the notion of proof. Okay, and I first became known for studying these near-death experiences while I was still a philosophy professor in '69 to '72. Then that was even before I went to medical school. And so, constantly since that time, concerned individuals, mostly I think in the context of a loss of a loved one and having grief, or often sometimes, like they are facing death themselves, and would come up to me very solicitously and say, Raymond, do we have any proof? Can we prove a life after death? And so, for a long time, year after year after year, when I would hear that, my mind would go back to Bertrand Russell and the Wittgenstein and Frege, and my knowledge of symbolic and mathematical logic and the predicate calculus. And I, over the years, I got it that people would just kind of, their eyes would go up. And so I realized that's not what people were asking me. And over the years, I kind of finally figured out, basically, quite apart from my work as a logic professor, but what people were asking me in that context was, Raymond, is it a rational thing to expect and anticipate that when we die, that our consciousness will continue, or, well, I would say magnify, or be liberated into some other level of reality? And what I would say is that absolutely, yes, it is a rational thing. Now, for those very few nerds like me who are interested in rational thinking and who know the objections that the great philosophers of history have brought to the question of life after death and the great difficulties involved, including the logical difficulties, espoused, for example, by David Hume, who was the great skeptic who influenced Einstein, for example. Einstein, said that his work was influenced by Hume, and that Hume pointed out that the question of an afterlife is not commensurable with the logic that we have. And all of these things I understand and have worked on. But what I would say to that small group of folks like me is that's worked out now too. It's, we have solved those logical difficulties that stand in the way of question of life after death. But very few people are going to be interested in that. But those who are interested in it can look it up, and you can see that we now have adequate logical ways for taking care of situations where what we're saying is unintelligible, which is the classical objection to the question of an afterlife, that it's unintelligible. But I know that's boring to most people. But what I'm saying is, to those few nerds like me, it's okay. I can show a way out. And also to those folks who are interested in this from the consolation purposes and those things. Yeah, this is came along. It was a long time coming for me, because my way all my life has been to try to rule out things. It's no fun to try to build a bridge to what you already think by coming up with some flimsy. What I want to do is I want to think something through, to think of all the objections first. And what comes out of that process in the long run and that's how I got to this situation now where I say, yeah, to my utter astonishment, there is an afterlife. And yeah, so I'm confident on those scores, and I also understand how many people need to know more about that in this age that we're living in.
So, in these 7 classes, we'll cover everything you just covered, and more extensively, and more, as I put it, edibly, uh, for people to get a grasp on the afterlife. You'll encounter 7 classes covering a wide variety of afterlife proof. Uh, with that said, let's take a look at some of these master classes, the titles, and what's behind them. Reason number 1 to believe in the afterlife is out of body experiences. When a person has an out of body experience and can share accurately what they saw during their separation from their body, then we have a shared death experience. Reason number 2, precognitive experiences. When you have a waking dream, for example, of a loved one being in danger or perhaps even dying, and then discover it indeed happened, you have a precognitive experience. These are psychic experiences and are the types of experiences we'll be looking at in this class. Reason number 3, the transforming light. Does a near death experience change a person in a visible and positive way? Yes. And if the change can be seen by other people, then what was witnessed is a shared death experience. How common is this? And exactly what changes? Those are the questions that will be covered in this class. Reason number 4, terminal lucidity. Terminal lucidity is a flash of alertness and vigor shortly before a person's death. But when it happens in the absence of brain activity, or during a disease like Alzheimer's or a devastating brain trauma, a major consciousness question is posed. How does consciousness take place in a brain that is no longer functional? And has consciousness separated from the brain and exists independent of the brain itself? We'll look into those questions in this class. Reason 5, spontaneous muses and the halls of knowledge. Many who have NDEs report visiting halls of knowledge where they can acquire new and oftentimes unfamiliar information. The result, new talents and new professions. In this class, you'll encounter some of those remarkable stories. Reason 6, light, mist, and music. Throughout history, death has been accompanied by light, mist, and music. Ancient and modern cases report that bystanders to a person's death sometimes report the presence of light emanating from the body of the dying. or a vapor like mist that appears at the point of death. In other case studies, bystanders at the deathbed hear heavenly music. Sometimes they hear it for days. Do these experiences prove separation of consciousness, or are they just emergency room campfire stories? This class tackles that mystery. And finally, reason number 7, the mysterious psychomantium. Encounters with departed loved ones can take place through facilitated apparitions, a series of ancient techniques revived through the research of Dr. Moody. This short course in facilitated apparitional encounters, The Return of the Dead, explains the science behind this ancient practice and provides photographic proof of contact with the other side. This course of masterclasses, Proof of Life After Life, presents a new arena for death studies. It opens the door to a world beyond circumstantial evidence and into a world of objective proof that there is an afterlife.